Yeah. And then we're all working on automating our instantaneous choice to question the ego's insanity, right? And rather than
Absolutely.
let it mull over for a while and see if it has any value. Right? Yeah.
Well, now come on, let's think about it. Maybe it does. All right, we are live on Zoom on YouTube right now, and so Bruce and I are reading "Absence from Felicity," the story of the scribing of A Course in Miracles, with Dr. Kenneth Wapnick, and it's all about Helen Schuckman and her the way she operated. Man, oh man, oh, this is great. We're getting. I mean, how could it's almost like I, I don't even know how it's almost like she really didn't have um, a choice, even though she did have a choice. But it was the voice of Jesus in her mind that was just, uh, and it drove her kind of crazy. She didn't really like it. Uh, she didn't ask for it. That's the thing I think is so interesting here. I've asked for it a million times, but she wasn't really asking for it.
Well, some part of her mind obviously asked for
Yes,
it, right? And
yes.
then just as some part of our mind is actually wanting the peace that can't be uh, compromised or lost or forsaken. I think it can be misplaced, but um, and that's what we've done by believing in separation, and which includes everything involving guilt, individuality, space, and time. That came up this week reviewing, I think it's lesson 133 that lists four different ways in which we can tell when we're valuing the valueless.
Hmm.
And I was looking at Ken Wapnick's commentary on that lesson and about a decade ago, and I scrawled in the margins. Let's see, there's time, space, individuality, and guilt, and then I realized if I run it backwards, it spells gist. And there's the gist of the ego, the gist of the belief in separation, the gist in valuing the valueless, right? Yeah.
Wow, yeah, and that's it exactly. If anything is any of those things, it is not real,
Yep.
and it cannot be real, and that's why it's so important for us to look at our thinking and all the crazy things we think are real, and ask those questions. Is it going to be happening next week just like this? Did it? Is it happening in a specific space? What is it that's really happening? And you'll recognize that none of our experience in this world really is real.
Mhm.
It's all based on one of those or all of those things. So, all right. So,
Well, ready to start on chapter 15 in
yeah.
Absence from Felicity, the story of Helen Schuckman and her scribing of A Course in Miracles by Kenneth Wapnick, PhD. And on my vintage book, uh, let's see, which printing was it? It's second printing, December 1991. I have us on page 401, and I'm looking on your shared screen on Zoom, and it shows page 385 of 492, or 78%. So we're coming up on 80% done. We're probably getting close to that next few weeks.
Yeah.
So
So,
chapter 15 is Other Scribings B.
all right. Now, do you want to read?
Sure, if you'd
Okay.
like me to. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like
Um,
you to.
okay, very good. Okay. The Gifts of God, Helen's Poetry. The Writing of the Poems is the subheading of the chapter. First subheading. Ken says, I mentioned in the preceding chapter my asking Helen in 1973 if there were anything else she had scribed, and her showing me the first part of what was to become the psychotherapy pamphlet. And that was it. Sometime after that, probably in the late fall, during the course of an informal discussion Helen, Bill, and I were having, Bill made casual reference to poems Helen had written down in 1971, sure that Helen had shown them to me. My ears perked up at the mention of these poems, and I said, Helen, what poems? She turned bright red in embarrassment, admitted the existence of such poems, but would not show them to me. Helen's discomfort and refusal to show the poems to me was odd, given the intimacy of our relationship, all the more as she knew I loved poetry as much as she did, especially Shakespeare, her favorite. Whenever I mentioned the poems, which I irrepressibly did from time to time, she continued to blush in embarrassment and still did not show them to me. Finally, she told me her reason. Quote, they are not much good, and I don't think you will like them, unquote. I persisted, however, sure that the poems were quite good, especially after Helen told me that they had come to her like the course and shared the same basic themes. You know, Helen, I would say to her, they would have to be at least halfway decent. Our discussions went on for a while, and finally, as Christmas approached, the first of many Christmases we would spend together, Helen relented and agreed that on Christmas Eve she would let me see these poems, her quote, guilty secret, unquote. It was extremely interesting to me just how uncomfortable Helen was. As distressed as A Course in Miracles made her feel, it was nothing compared to the anxiety set off by these poems. She had relatively little trouble after a while showing certain people some of the more poetic and beautifully written sections of the Course. She took great pride in these as a matter of fact, although it was clear to her she was not their author. But the poetry was something else again. After dinner that Christmas Eve, the big moment came. Helen took out the poems, all neatly typed and kept in a file folder, which she had buried in a drawer. Sitting with Helen at her dinette table, I began to read them, and not surprisingly, liked them very much. There were 58 poems in all. The earliest one, called, quote, The Gifts of Christmas, unquote, was written on Christmas Day, 1969, while Helen was taking down the workbook. I had actually seen that poem before, as Bill had placed it at the beginning of the binder that held the first part of the workbook manuscript. The second poem, The Singing Reed, was written in March 1971, while the remaining 56 were all written in a 2-month period in fall of 1971. Wow, it's pretty
Wow.
prolific. Yeah. While not great poetry, as I believe many of the later poems are, these early ones, all relatively objective in tone, were lovely little expressions of many of the themes found in A Course in Miracles. They were certainly nothing of which I felt Helen should have been ashamed, but of course it was not really the poems that caused such embarrassment for Helen, but what they represented about her. I shall explain this below. And I am flashing onto something that might have been it certainly was in one of Ken's talks, maybe several, but probably in this book, Absence from Felicity, where Ken um, basically recounts how Jesus was saying he could help something to the effect of he could help Helen much more, except she's too ashamed of him
Yes.
being Jesus. Yeah. And I think I can relate to that too. Because I mean, I think if you think of the people in the world that if you were to say you were involved in, you know, even a pure non-dual, uh, pure metaphysical study of Jesus, uh, and his course, I think there's probably a lot of people without having a proper context might be very dismissive and or critical and or whatever. Um, and I can relate to that reluctance to share and on that level and in that context. But I think it runs a lot deeper than that, probably for all of us in some way or another, because we're basically um, ashamed, or guilty or embarrassed by the fact that we made a silly choice that we think is a sin, and the Course tells us emphatically and yet gently in so many words throughout that no, it's just a correctable error. Yeah, you can afford to be happily wrong, um, and that's part of the resolution, part of the resurrection of the mind is realizing that I just made a silly, forgivable mistake. And I love how Ken says it's not evil, sinful, or wicked. It's just silly.
Just
And
silly.
yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
such a redeeming idea, isn't it?
It is really, I mean, just take back my own innocence
Yeah.
and remember I didn't do anything. But I can understand for one thing, I cannot imagine even me if Jesus came in here and started talking to me. Uh, I might be able to say to you, hey, Jesus is in here talking to me, or Jesus, I hear Jesus' voice in my mind or whatever. But I'm not going to go tell my sister that. I'm not going to go tell the neighbors that. I'm not going to tell people in my office where I work that, because yes, not it's not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I think that first off, you will not believe me. You will think that I'm crazy.
Uh-huh.
You will think that I'm making something up, having an imagination. You know,
Uh,
and I'll tell you why exactly how I see this, Bruce, because I see that when people say, "Oh, Jesus told me this," or um, I channeled this, that, and the other thing. I mean, I hear this a lot in my business. You probably maybe do too. I don't know. Uh,
sure.
and how many times do I think, I that don't sound like Jesus to me. And so that ain't what he
What
told
you talking,
me.
Willis?
That's not what he told me. Um,
Right.
and so, yeah, you put yourself in a position where, people are going to question you and they're going to disbelieve you and they're going to think that maybe you're maybe attention seeking or all kinds of things. I mean, that's the last thing. Helen didn't want to draw attention to herself.
Right. She was a very private person in many respects. Yep.
So I can see a lot of, why, maybe not ashamed of Jesus, but ashamed of herself to the point where uh, she didn't feel uh, comfortable or open enough to share something like this. These are things that came to her. She didn't even, it sounds like they just came just the way the course came.
Hmm.
And so she couldn't just say, I practiced really hard and tried to make a nice poem. She just say, I wrote these things down and not they're not connected to me. So I don't know if there are any that she literally decided I'm going to write a poem and sat down and write it down out of her own mind, or if these all came from this. And we all say Jesus because it's convenient, but it really is the Holy Spirit. It's the source of everything, and not just a man whispering in our ear or whatever.
Well,
Uh,
and I think that's the context that if we don't have the context that this is a symbolic um, part of our right mind that is represents the sanity to look at the insanity without condemnation. That if we understand that, which usually takes a good while of studying the course and really plumbing its depths, that context then makes it not make sense. But without that context, we do the level confusion thing almost automatically and think, oh, you're talking about, some dis dis discarnate um, ghost of a body that walked on the earth a couple of millennia ago that is credited with both with healing a lot of people and also causing a lot of wars. I mean, there's a schizophrenic thing right there that might be questionable right off the bat, right?
Exactly right off the bat, yeah. And so yeah, there's you just reminded me when you said a lot of wars. I was listening to Adi Shanti yesterday, um, and I think he was talking about Saint Francis of Assisi, who had
Uh-huh.
went to um, uh, the Middle East I can't remember the name of the guy that he went to see, but anyway, he was a leader over there to try to convince him to end the Crusades. And I'm sitting there thinking, they didn't start the Crusades. That was not something that they wanted. That was a Christian thing that people did. But there's that that misappropriation of you know what really did happen here, what it really is happening here. Um, anyway, I thought that was a very funny thing to think, and it was very cool too. Uh, um, I guess I can read now. I
Okay.
just got out of a group that for some I don't understand even. I can't even understand it. A whole group of people. There was probably 10 people in the group. Not a single one person raised their hand and said something the entire time.
Huh.
I read the entire lesson and discussed the entire lesson by myself. It
Maybe you
was,
were just mesmerizing.
I guess, weird. Yeah.
Or an introspective morning for some lots. I don't know.
It could have been, but usually I have a lot of discussion in that group, so
Yeah.
and nobody said a thing, and I just sat here and just talked for the whole time.
Uh,
Really, not that I'm having trouble talking, obviously, uh, but
yeah, you and I don't have that problem, right?
no, thank
Yeah.
goodness for that. It's that air sign. See, uh,
Yep.
we're airy folk. There's not
Uh-huh.
many of us. I'm always surprised when I find out, everybody's either a Taurus or a Leo or a Scorpio or something. So anyway,
Is that your fixed belief?
yes, that's my fixed belief.
Little astrological pun there.
That's hilarious. Okay, so Ken continues. As I was reading the poems, Helen watched me with bated breath to see my reaction, and she appeared very relieved when I obviously liked them. Helen then talked a little bit about the poetry, how she had written it down, etc., and I commented again how nice it was. I added that perhaps we should do something about publishing the poems and making them available to others. Yeah, Ken's always got good ideas. Helen, incidentally, never wished the poems, the early as well as the more sophisticated later ones to be published during her lifetime, and relatively few people even knew of them. A year after her death, Foundation for Inner Peace published them under the title The Gifts of God. And it's real interesting. This morning, when Larry was reading from the course, he read the exact term, the gifts of God, exactly when I was looking at the title of this. I was like,
Yeah.
wow, the gifts of God coming from inside and out.
It's amazing sometimes like, since I attend a lot of online course classes and study groups and facilitate a few, and it's interesting how often people in groups that don't have any overlap in terms of the people who attend them are minimal will often be covering the same workbook lesson or the same section in a chapter of the text or whatever, and or the subjects are pulling quotes from the same quotes, on the same day or within a day or two of each other. So I think it's the minds are joined thing. I just figure.
Yeah, that's the whole point of today's lesson. When I'm not
Yeah,
healed,
exactly.
when I'm healed, I'm not healed alone. You know,
Another synchronicity. It's amazing.
our minds are joined. Oh, can have found a better mind to join with, Bruce. I love you so much. Uh, okay. So that Christmas Eve was lovely, and I left shortly after reading the poems through a second time. I saw Helen the next day, Christmas, and she greeted me at the door with a gift of the 58 poems, which she retyped for me after I had left.
Wow.
Wow. But not
That's a lot of
only
typing.
that, not only that, she had also written down 3 or 4 other poems, which she now presented me with as well. 2 were Christmas poems, Nativity and the Holiness of Christmas. This was the beginning of the second phase of Helen's poetry. Several poems followed between Christmas Eve and New Year's. Helen wrote down 10 poems in all. She continued to write poems on and off for the next 5 years, with
Hmm.
the last poem, The Second Easter, written for Easter 1978. The prose poem entitled The Gifts of God, which I shall discuss below, was completed shortly afterwards, and that basically marked the end of Helen's scribing, or at least the end of what she would let you see. I don't know.
Hmm.
I might be
Yeah.
kidding. Uh,
Well, maybe, who knows? I mean, there are multiple storage units in Marin County with, because when Helen and Bill were gone, Judy and the FIP inherited a lot of their legacy memorabilia and whatnot. And then when Ken passed, I guess uh, the Foundation for A Course in Miracles decided that there was a fair amount of other material of Ken's that also is in their archives. And how much of that still would be of interest to other course students, I don't know. But I just figure I've got plenty enough just going through with the stuff that's publicly available from Ken and the foundation, and that keeps me plenty busy.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, they already sorted through it all and gave us the best part of it, or gave us
I
the part
think
of it
so.
that we
I think
need.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yep,
So, and if there is more to ha be had, it'll come up.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's all here somewhere. In fact, I've read many things here since we've been reading this, Absence from Felicity, that are things that were kind of in my mind of, yeah, somewhere or the other, I heard there was this thing, this was said or whatever. And here it is, right here. It was right in the book all along. So I
Hmm.
didn't have to go looking for it. I just had to uh, reread what I already had forgotten completely. Okay, I will continue reading.
Okay.
Uh, Before proceeding, let me discuss the actual writing of the poetry. In one sense, Helen wrote down the poems just as she had written down A Course in Miracles, and thus we can say that the poetry was scribed. In another sense, however, Helen considered the poems also partly hers, and that, of course, was a source of her embarrassment. Thus, because she always felt that her voice played a part in their transmission, one could describe the process of taking down the poems as a shared inspiration with Jesus, a collaborative venture, as it were. And I'm just going to stop there for just a second. I pretty much get that about the whole course. I mean, to me, I don't think Jesus went to school and got a PhD in psychology. But you read the course and you get a lot of psychological concepts
Hmm.
and theories and obviously if Joe the plumber had been writing the course, you wouldn't have been reading in iambic pentameter, or you would have been reading about uh, psychology, the very specific terms and stuff. So I think her voice was in all of it.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and certainly, as Ken points out throughout this book we're reading, as well as elsewhere, Helen's experience, her love of Plato and Shakespeare and Freud and the style that the Bible's written, so many other things, and as well as just her background in psychology in general, and so many other different parts of her life and experience, you know, really tremendously influence the form that the course takes. But the content, it really is there if you're looking for it, that's independent of the form. And I think that's the whole point of the course, is to, um, you know, as we're learning it, to generalize and realize that everyone has access to this material in their mind. And Helen just was particularly, crystal clear and eloquent and when she was channeling this material.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I just that was an aside that I thought, yeah, no, I think Kellen's voice is throughout the entire thing.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
sure.
she probably, you know, didn't even relate that she was any part of that.
Yeah.
So I'll continue reading. Many of the poems are written in the first person, with Jesus obviously being the voice. In some of these, especially the Easter poems, he speaks about his crucifixion and resurrection, and the voice is clearly the very loving and gentle one of the course. However, in several poems, the first person is Helen herself, though clearly not the person she experienced herself to be. Rather, it was a voice coming from a part of herself that she has successfully dissociated. That was the word I was thinking of, dissociation. That's a concept that's psychological, not uh,
Hmm.
I mean, you do have dissociation in plumbing, but it's a different kind of thing. Okay, but but which broke through her defensive system. Occasionally, this voice is pained, as we shall see in some examples below, expressing Helen's bitterness and disappointment over what she experienced as Jesus not keeping his promises. In other poems, the voice is filled with love and gratitude, as found in the Valentine's Day trilogy of love poems. Thus, the poetry gave voice to a part of Helen that she was not in touch with at all, and a part that certainly had no expression in her personal life. In this sense, then, many of these later poems are clearly personal, while A Course in Miracles is not. It is interesting to note that Helen always loved poetry, especially the renowned poets of Great Britain, and as mentioned earlier, she once had aspirations of being a world famous poet herself.
Hmm. Wow.
Therefore, in distinction from A Course in Miracles, which was scribed directly from the voice of Jesus and characterized by Helen as a process of internal dictation, we may simply characterize the writing process of the poems as inspired. Wow. So that I see that, okay, the something that's being channeled versus something that's being inspired.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think a lot of times we think we're being channeling, but really we're inspired.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why it don't sound like Jesus to me.
Right. Right. And there's a lot of things that you find online in social media that, I think are inspired, but they don't have the quality of what, comes through in Helen's uh, describing, it would seem. I mean, but any distinction that wants to make a big deal about the distinctions would obviously be, the perfect fodder for the ego's separation sabotage, right? Of
Yeah,
peace.
yeah,
It's like if we can recognize things without making big deals out of them, and in the same way that it's important to discern red from yellow from green lights at an intersection. It's probably be a very helpful thing to learn how to do and, and behave accordingly. But but it doesn't mean we need to judge, or get upset when the colors change, right? Yeah.
yeah, no, yeah. Uh,
It's the condemning thoughts that, of course, I think is really saying, that's what you got to pay attention to, not the things in which there's negligible investment, and at some point even the negligible investments go away.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that the course is consistently telling us that the world that we see is a product of our own imagination, and that it's
Hmm.
an interpretation of a thought, but that it's not real. So, if you could, like you were saying in the lesson is a 133 that it goes through what are the qualities of reality, what makes something real, and if you once you recognize that what is real uh, uh, is never changes, it
Yep.
can't be
Yep.
changed. And what's unreal then just doesn't even exist at all. Once you get that, then whatever channeling you hear or inspired whatever you hear, you're easily able to discern, is this talking about a quality that is uh, uh, fleeting, or is it
Yep.
talking about a quality that is permanent and real?
Yeah. Yeah. And that unchanging nature is such an important aspect of truth, and we really don't even know. You know, we don't really have much reference for what is truly unchanging. Everything in the material world that we think of, and we think of as like galaxies and locally, mountains and continents, and but continents drift, mountains come and go in geologic time, and galaxies are being born and destroyed and ripping each other apart when they collide. You know, so anything that's involving space and time is ephemeral or temporary, and anything that involves change of any sort, or variability or instability, um, is not the truth. And even though it's hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around what that might be, there's a part of our mind that knows that we've never left truth, and I think that's why we're drawn to the Course. Um, what what I always come to when I think of the unchanging nature of truth, um, and the things that are kind of symbolic of it, like the mathematical laws and properties, things like that, are they don't change. For our king and prince or potentate, I think there's a phrase in Freemasonry, something like that, that it doesn't alter. What comes to mind is Sonnet 116 by Shakespeare. Have I read this in our Saturday morning discussions before?
I
I've
don't
I've read
think
it.
so. No, I
Oh,
don't
I've read it
remember you
many
did.
times before in other Zoom groups, but I've just brought it up. If you just Google Sonnet 116, you can find it very quickly, and it's very short. If you don't mind, I'd love to read it real quickly because I think
Oh, sure. Please
it fits
do.
very nicely. Yeah. And there's one word before I start. There's the word bark, and if you think like when you get on a boat, you embark, right? So bark really just means like a boat or a ship. Anyway, here's Sonnet 116 by William Shakespeare. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Anyway, I just really find that inspiring.
That is really inspiring, and
I'll,
I
I'll
can
put the link to
absolutely
that in the
see.
chat. Yeah,
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, I
sure.
can absolutely see too that I mean the rosy lips and I mean I
Yeah.
can see some references here.
Oh,
But
yeah. I mean, obviously, Shakespeare was tuning into the same inspiration as Helen in terms of, the ideas that, love and truth cannot change. If it alters, if it's shaken, if it wanders like our our minds do, then it's not truth. It's I think that's why Gloria and Ken chose the lighthouse as a symbol. It's like, it's built on the rock and it just does nothing but shine its light steadily without change. Well, of course, actual lighthouses, they usually have a rotating beacon, but the idea of the light being there in a fixed location, that speaking of fixed, we were talking about earlier, fixed zodiac signs. Um, but that's the anchor to which we really um, you know are drawn to. We're drawn to true stability in our mind, and anything else is less than satisfying. Can't possibly fulfill us, right?
right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And but that's why we go through our lives in just like we're starving. We are
Hmm.
we're starving for love, starving for food, starving for attention, starving for I mean that we're the hungry ghosts are us.
The hungry
Uh,
dogs of fear, right?
the hungry dogs of fear, yeah, we're
Hmm.
and that starvation comes from that emptiness that comes from not not realizing our own connection, again, that connection that makes us whole, uh,
Hmm.
as long as we're keeping ourselves separate, dissociating ourselves from each other, we can't be filled, we can't be whole uh, when we're keeping the separation there. It's just it's pretty amazing that to imagine that we're doing it. I'm doing it to myself uh, every time I make a choice to not
Yeah.
forgive. So,
Yeah.
all
And
right,
it's an undoable, or is it? Yes, it's undoable, forgivable, silly choice when we realize that we've wanted to be separate, and then and just notice very dispassionately, calmly, it's like, well, that hasn't made us happy. In
yeah,
fact, it's made us miserable. And seeing that we're masochists in in every sense of the word, that by choosing the ego is what motivates us to want to be more consistent, choosing against it.
yeah, and just even the little bit of peace that comes when we are not in that total terror.
Hmm.
Which is, I mean, believe me, if you don't recognize it and pay attention, you may not recognize that that you're terrified. But we go through life, suspecting everything and in fear of everything. Where terror is our everyday experience, and we've just kind of gotten so used to it that we just think that it's normal. There's
Hmm.
nothing normal about living in fear. It's
Nope, not at all.
and nothing necessary about it either because there's nothing to fear. Oh my gosh. I'm going to
Yeah.
let you read a little bit. My voice is getting a little hoarse here.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, I think yeah.
The poems.
The poems that would come at almost any time or any place, and Helen was not really in conscious control of them. She would start a poem on a bus, in a taxi, while we were walking, or when alone in her apartment. She would usually scrawl one or two lines at a minimum in her notebook if that were handy, or if not, then on any scrap of paper that was available, and that would, quote, save, unquote, the poem. She could then finish it later, even if, quote, later, unquote, were months in the future, as occasionally happened. Sounds very much like the writing that she was doing, that she could start and stop at any time and pick up right where she left off.
Well,
Of
and
course.
the fact is that it was already written, so she's just copying what
Yeah,
was already written in
yeah,
the
yeah,
script.
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
She was just playing cosmic Xerox. And if the machine was paused, she just toggled the pause button and had it come through again. Huh? Another major difference in transmission between A Course in Miracles and the poetry, however, was that the Course came through without any impediment at all. There was no difficulty in Helen's, quote, hearing, unquote, and the Course material just flowed through her, especially after the first month or so of the process. Helen's anxiety, as we have seen, had no effect on the flow of the dictation. That was not the case with the poems, at least with the later ones. As far as I can gather, both from the ease and speed with which they were written, as well as Helen's own recollections to me, the early poems came rather quickly. However, many of the poems that followed that 1973 Christmas Eve were written down with a lot of difficulty. Stanzas would be inverted, lines would be out of sequence, etc. Sometimes Helen could not really hear clearly between two phrases, so she would write both phrases down, and later on we would decide which one should be used. There was also a great deal of resistance to many of the poems, which we shall discuss later regarding Helen's personal relationship with them. While Helen resisted the temptation to edit the course, even though she was tempted to do that many times, she did not feel she had to resist that temptation with the poetry. Rather, Helen felt that it was her prerogative to make the poems better, and she very often would change words or phrases, though not to any great extent, to be sure. It was therefore clear that she felt a kind of personal connection with the poetry, which she did not believe she had with the course. As I have said, the process of taking down the poetry did not go nearly as smoothly as when Helen was scribing A Course in Miracles. Helen always kept steno notebooks in which she recorded the course, and there is one notebook which contains some of the poems. For the most part, however, the poems, excuse me, were written on anything that was around, backs of envelopes, small notepaper, and the like. One of my assignments became to rescue these little pieces of paper, which could otherwise have very easily become forever lost, in Helen's pocketbook, bureau drawer, or simply thrown out. Helen's anxiety led her often to absent-mindedness, and she was always misplacing things. While taking down the course, she once left her notebook in a taxi, only to have the driver run after her to return it to her. Typed pages of the course manuscript somehow ended up amidst psychological reports to be found later by an embarrassed secretary and returned to her. And so whenever Helen would write down something, I would quickly take it from her for safekeeping. That's funny. Sometimes poems would be written over a period of days. At other times, as already has been mentioned, Helen would write fragments of lines that would simply hang around. I kept these in a folder, and every once in a while I would take them out and say to Helen, "Here's a poem you haven't finished. Why don't you take the rest of it down?" Helen had a very strong will, and it was impossible to get her to do anything she really did not want to do. She might not be the only one who has a strong will. And we probably could all relate to that, if not in ourselves, other people we've known or lived with, right? Um, let's see. Okay, and but there were times when she would protest and put up a fight that I knew was superficial. After a while, I was able to tell the difference pretty well. When I felt that there was a part of her that was open to continue a poem or even take one down, I would urge her to do that. I had the most success around Christmas and Easter, which is why there are several of these, as well as my birthday. Other occasions that seemed suitable for a poem would also come up for a try. Some of the poems that resulted from these efforts and their circumstances I will describe below. Occasionally, I would be, quote, subtle, unquote, like putting the notebook under Helen's pillow so that she would get the hint when she went to sleep. I even, that sounds almost sneaky, but good for Ken. I even once wrote Helen a poem asking her to write me a special poem. I'd forgotten about that. That's funny. Oh, that's cute.
He is such a jokester, man.
Oh, Helen, dear, would you write me a poem? I'm off to Alaska to visit friends in Nome. Yes, that's a spontaneous, horrible poem. On the other, on the one hand, of course, the poems were not nearly as significant as A Course in Miracles. On the other hand, however, the poems, laterally the personal poems especially, had an important, if not special, place in Helen's experience as they enabled her again to have access to a part of her mind that she had otherwise split off from her awareness. I believe this is why, despite her occasional protestations to the contrary, she was proud of the poems and agreed to let me, quote, badger, unquote, her about taking them down. In addition, the poems have the obvious value of helping so many people relate to their own spiritual experience, and even more specifically to their ambivalent relationship to Jesus, as we noted since day one of reading this book, huh?
Absolutely.
Yep. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Helen.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jesus. Jesus obviously valued them as well. One morning we were leaving Helen's apartment for the medical center, and Helen had her notebook with her as she was in the midst of taking down a poem. We were almost out the door when she stopped to express concern about not having taken with her a psychological report she was working on. Jesus replied to her, "That is not what you will leave behind you," referring to the important legacy of her poetry, not to mention A Course in Miracles itself, and not her professional work, which her ego, of course, considered to be of great value. There was only one time when a fragment of a poem continually resisted all my efforts at convincing Helen to complete it. the way he put that is kind of funny. The fragment resisted all my efforts at convincing. It's like
Yeah,
we've given the poem the power to uh, to resist Ken's efforts at convincing Ellen to complete it. Anyway, just interesting turn of phrase. All the other fragments eventually found a home in a poem, but somehow Helen could never finish this particular one. The lines seemed particularly interesting, not to mention profound, yet my urgings were always in vain. Finally, after many, many months of this, Helen said to me that this fragment was not a poem at all, but belonged in the course itself. It was dated June 15th, 1971, while Helen was taking down the workbook, and shortly before the period when she took down a bevy of the quote, little unquote poems. But the fragment reflected a much more sophisticated level than these early poems, and one that was indeed more befitting of A Course in Miracles. And then Helen said to me, find the place for it. And so I did, obviously with a lot of help. The challenge of finding the perfect fit involved both the form and content. The fragment was in blank verse, and so the setting had to fit in with the poetry. And of course, the theme of the fragment had to match the theme of the paragraph in which it would be placed. Where it clearly belonged comes near the end of chapter 27, in the 10th paragraph of the section, The Dreamer of the Dream. The fragment does seem to fit seamlessly in the middle of that paragraph. The 8 lines, as Helen originally wrote them, are: There is a risk of thinking death is peace, because the world equates the body with the self which God created, yet a thing can never be its opposite. And death is opposite to peace, because it is the opposite of life, and life is peace. Awaken and forget all thoughts of death, and you will find you have the peace of God. Wow.
very interesting. You know what? Just real quickly,
Uh-huh.
I want to look for that. And is
Yeah.
this in the course where we have um, these little, I call them prayers, where they're places where
Italicized.
it's italicized, just a little
I think it
poem
might,
kind of thing?
it might,
That they're like
I
these
don't,
little
actually, I
poems.
don't think that is italicized, but I'm going to look it up too in the web edition.
Yeah, let's
So
see.
let's see,
Where,
chapter 27, Dreamer of the Dream.
it's like in Bible class when they you had to go and look up things. Whoever looked it up first got a
Yeah.
prize.
What one of the lines in paragraph 7 that is one Ken quotes frequently that I also put in my Recovering Bliss Ninny calendar on ACIM blog if anybody wants a calendar that's now, you know, a better part of half a year out of date. But it's is this line of of one thing you were sure of all the many causes you perceived as bringing pain and suffering to you, your guilt was not among them. I think that's one of the Bliss Ninny quotes I put in there. So let's see. Risk of thinking. Let's search for risk. Now we got a little treasure hunt here. Okay. Oh, here it is. Yeah, chapter 10. Okay. Or excuse me, paragraph 10. Okay, it's chapter 27, section 7, paragraph 10, and it starts on line 2. There's a risk of thinking death is peace because the world equates the body with the self, which God created. Yet a thing can never be its opposite. Yeah, I think this is actually
Yeah,
verbatim.
yeah.
And death is opposite to peace because it is the opposite of life. And life is peace. Awaken and forget all thoughts of death, and you will find you have the peace of God. Wow. And it's just seamlessly part of the middle of paragraph 10, and then which ends with, yet if the choice is really given you, then you must see the causes of things you choose exactly as they are and where they are. And
Wow.
and and of course that fits in beautifully with that um, line of of all the many choices of what was bothering you, you didn't think your guilt was it, the causes of your suffering.
That's amazing. That's
Yeah.
amazing. I didn't really, know all this about, how the course itself is constructed but I do know that there were things that came after even
Hmm.
that probably should have been in here, but it's already been published. And that part that we read the last week about when Jesus talked about the resurrection,
Hmm.
what actually happened during the resurrection. He does allude to that in the
Right.
course, but actually, that particular uh, uh, discussion wasn't in there in that way.
Yeah.
So, it seemed like kind of just an ongoing thing here.
Yeah, really. Hey, I need to leave a few minutes early, so
Oh, okay.
how about if I read the last paragraph in that section, then that'll cue us
Okay.
up for reading the poems next week.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So Ken says, I should mention that almost all of Helen's poems are written in iambic pentameter, Shakespeare's meter. The only exception to this is in the later poems is, quote, the invitation, unquote, wherein four lines are shorter than the 5 meters or measures. And of course, as mentioned above, much of A Course in Miracles is also in the same blank verse. In fact, Helen did not consider any ametric poem to be a poem. I wrote a large number of poems myself, many of them for Helen, and as I shall mention below, one of them was not in meter, and Helen disdainfully said after a quick scan, "This is not a poem." I'm using my voice instead of hers. We have already seen how Helen paid careful attention to the form or style of the course and how pleased she was with the high poetic level of its language. She therefore considered this poetry to be Jesus' gift to her. So very nice. So yeah, I'm hosting a School for A Course in Miracles session in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to leave a few minutes early today, and we're all set up on page 407 in my book. So I'm going to put a mark there and look forward to picking up where we left off. And thank you, Lynn and Dove and Sharon and whoever else is listening. And have a wonderful, peaceful week.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here and have fun with the
Likewise.
School for A Course in Miracles. Bye bye.
Likewise. Have a great week.